Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be expanding our knowledge of object-oriented programming by learning about object methods. Specifically, we're going to talk about what object methods are and what their purposes are. We're going to talk about the subject of how to call object methods, the syntax that's used to do that. We're going to talk about a special variable known as the this variable, which is going to be important for use within our object methods. We're going to briefly talk about what are known as getter and setter methods. And then we're going to finish up by talking about how to output the results of object methods within double quoted strings and how to basically use this variable we're going to learn about to be able to call one object method from within another object method. So basically classes can define functions. In a way, we've been having our own function libraries. For example, filelib.php has been a library that just contains a number of function definitions that we've been able to use. Well, actually, when you create or define a class, for example, the item class, you can actually define functions that are known, and when they're part of a class, they're known functions that are part of a class definition are known as methods. And basically, they are functions that work on a particular object. Basically, so when you define an instance of the item class, for example, it might have a method that says return cost. And when you call that method on that particular item, it'll return maybe the price of that, the price property of that particular item. Basically, the methods are defined object methods. And it's still it's a function, but again, the terminology with object is called the methods. It's defined within the class definition, just like a class's properties. It's defined within the curly braces. We're going to take a look at it, what it looks like in a second. It has the same syntax that we use for defining functions, and that it even uses the function keyword. The one difference is that actually we place the public keyword in front of, at least for the time being, we're going to be placing the public keyword in front of the function keyword. So let's take a look at a class person where we've defined a function, or defined a class method, excuse me. So for example, we have a person class with two properties, first name and last name, which would just be strings to represent the first name and last name of the person. And this is what we've seen before. We've come across this in when we first learned about objects, about how to define properties. But also, if you look down here, you can see that we've actually defined a function. It's within the curly braces of the class definition, which means that it's a method of this person class. And we use the keyword public and then function, and we say public function, and then we define the method just as we would any other function that we've done before. In this case, we define a function called hello, a method called hello that takes 0 arguments. It doesn't return anything. It actually just outputs an echo statement. So basically anything that we've been able, all the rules that apply to functions that we had learned about, or in the introductory course that you know about from your experience with PHP, is going to apply to object methods as well. So we know that we can define methods and objects, but how do we call them? Well, first of all, you have to have an instance of an object to call the method. And then in order to do that, to call the method, you actually use the same sort of accessor syntax that we use to access the values of the different properties, and use that to call the method on an object's method. So for example, let's say we define a variable called person1, and we set it equal to a new instance of the person class, of this person class that we've talked about. Well, in order to call the hello method on that person, we list the name of the variable, followed by the dash and the greater than sign. And then instead of following that by the property name, we follow it by the name of the function. In this case, we had a function called hello. And the way that you distinguish that as a function as opposed to a property is you include a pair of parentheses afterwards, which is sort of intuitive because that's basically the syntax we use for functions. Now, for example, if our hello method of our person class took a parameter, then we would also specify these parameters within the parentheses, just as you would anytime we've been calling any other functions that take parameters. So let's actually take a look at if we look at our person class, we define this function hello. Let's take a look at a file called hello.php that's actually going to call that method, so we can sort of see this in action. So we've we have a test file here that includes the definition of the person class. We instantiate or create a new instance of a person object. We go ahead and we use the accessor syntax to go ahead and set the first name and last name properties of this particular person object, this instance of a person object. And then we're going to actually call or invoke the hello method for this particular person object. So in this case, we use the dash greater than sign, and then we say hello with parentheses. So if we actually go and run, and if we just quickly look back, all our hello function does is just outputs or echoes a statement that says hello. If we go and look at this lecture example and we look at hello.php, we can see that the output of it is a person says hello. And that's a result of calling this hello method on this person object. And so that's basically the syntax that you use to invoke an object's method. One other thing to do is, for example, we could, just as with other functions, we could include parameters. So let's include one parameter. It's a string called world. Now we could go to our person class, modify the function definition so that it accepts a string, and then say, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to echo. We're going to have an echo statement, but we're going to echo the, actually we can echo the string that was passed in. So now we have an object function, an object method that can take a parameter as well. So if we go ahead and both of these are saved and we reload our page, and actually let's make this string we're passing, okay, it's world, so it'll be different. And we go ahead and refresh our page, we can say a person says world. So there you can see how an object method functions or works just like a regular function does. One other thing to note is that object methods can return values just like a normal function can. So for example, let's say we had an object that modeled a shopping cart, which is something we're actually going to be adding to our web application. But let's say we already had that and we've declared an instance of it. So we have this cart1 variable that's an object of our shopping cart class. Maybe that shopping cart class has a method on it called calc cart total, which is a function we've been using in our utility library. Well, if you run that calc cart total function on a particular cart object, let's say it calculates that cart total and returns it as a value. So here, basically what you do in order to get the value, to get the return value of object method is you just call it just like you would a regular function, and you can use an assignment statement. So in this case, we're assigning the value returned from the calc cart total function into the total variable. Now that's the same thing as if we had maybe instead done total equals, oops, calc cart total, or maybe we passed it an array of the items in the cart. Whereas this would return the value, basically the return value of this function takes its place and total gets set to it. The same thing happens here. The return value of this whole object sort of statement gets returned and gets set into the value total. So for example, we could alter our hello function, our hello method of our person class, to instead of actually echoing the string, we could have it return a particular string. So for example, get rid of the echo statement and just have it return a static string that says a person says hello. So now what we can do is if we actually run this the way it is, what's going to happen is it's going to call this hello method. It's going to call the hello method. It's going to return a value, but we're not echoing it, and it's not echoing in the function. So actually, if we run the script again, nothing's going to happen. No output's going to happen for that function. So what we do is we update it to just echo the result of that. So here's an example of having an object, an instance of an object, calling a method on it that returns a value, and then using that value, using that return value, just as you would a return value from any other function. So here we're going to echo the value returned by this hello function, hello method of the person object, which is going to be that string. And if we refresh the page now, we can see that it goes ahead and output it. So that's an example of how object methods can also return values as well. Now, that particular function it didn't do too much, especially it didn't do anything related to the object. It just output a simple string. We could just create a regular function to do that. Typically, the reason you create object methods is so that they can perform some actions on that particular object. One of the main things that they can do is that the functions defined within an object can access the members or the properties of that particular object, and actually even the other methods of a particular object. And the way that you do that is using there's a special variable called this. It's $this. And you can use it within class methods. And basically what it does is refers to a current instance of an object. And it's kind of an abstract concept. So let's take a look at what it looks like in code so that it'll make a little more sense. Let's say we have our person object. Now we have our hello function. Now we've created a new function, a new method. You can have as many methods for an object for a class as you want. We're calling it getFirstName, and we just want it to basically return the first name of this person object. Now we could do that. We could access that using our typical accessor syntax, but for the sake of this lesson and learning the material, we're going to do it through the method. And basically what you do is, in order to access the first name attribute, the first name property of this particular person object, you use this variable, and then you use the accessor syntax followed by the property name that you want to get. So for example, if we define, let's say we have this test script, this.php, we define two person objects. We set both the first name and last name of each of the different objects. And then we're going to call this getFirstName method that we've defined on each person. So for example, person 1, it's defined as we set the first name to Joe, last name equal to Smith. So when we call this getFirstName function, what it's going to do is it's going to invoke this getFirstName function, and it's going to return the value of this the value of the property first name of this variable. Now this variable changes for each particular object instance. So basically each object instance, every time you call this getFirstName function, this is sort of reassigned a new value. So when we call this function on our person1 object, this is going to actually refer to person1. So in a way, it's as if we replace it with person1 slash first name. But the way you do that within a class definition is you just use this. Now the reason for doing that is that now we can reuse that. If I go back and type it again, if we had person1 here, now this function would only work with a variable named person1. By using this special variable this that can change its value depending on which instance of an object is being used, we can reuse this code, we can reuse this method, and so it's going to work for every object we create of this type. So for example, person1, we had set their first name equal to Joe. So when we call getFirstName on person1, this in that method is going to refer to person1, and it's going to get its first name property, which is Joe. Now when we go down here on person2 and we call getFirstName, this variable, when that method gets run, is going to refer to this person2 object whose first name is Jane, and it's going to get that, and it's going to return that property. And so what that does is it's the same method that gets run, has the same code, but it returns different values because this variable gets, each time that method's called, this variable sort of gets reset to the variable of the object that you're working on. So for example, when we run this script, what it's actually going to output is the name of both of our different people. So if we run this.php, we can see the person first names are Joe and Jane. And if we look at our code, we can say that we just had two echo statements that called the getFirstName method on person1 and getFirstName on person2. So you can see that each of those methods returned a different value. It returned the first name value for that particular instance of that object because when the method is called, this variable changes to become the instance of the object you're operating on. Now, one thing to notice is that, for example, let's say, and this is a required thing. So let's say we, in this function, we wanted to access this first name property. Well, you might think that you could just access it using this $ first name, because we say, hey, we've got this class. It's got the first name variable defined in it. Let's just return first name. If we go ahead and try and do this, and we run our script, we're going to get an error saying that that variable is undefined, first name is undefined. So it's very important that when you do want to access a member properties or properties of a class within a method, you use the this keyword. Oops. So now when we set it back to what it was before, it's going to work. So again, because this variable is kind of an abstract concept, I just want to kind of to maybe draw a little diagram to explain it a little bit better. So for example, let's say we just have a class that we've defined called X. It's got one property in it, and we'll just call it var1. And it's got one method. That's just going to return a value of the var1 variable, the var1 class property. And it's going to use the this. Oops. It's going to use the this special variable. So what this essentially does is when we define a class, we're defining a template. And we're saying this is a template for any variables that we declare of this data type, so of this class or this user-defined data type. So we're saying that anytime we define a variable that's of the class X, it's going to have a property var1, and it's going to be able to execute this var1 function. And so basically, it's code that defines a data type, defines methods that can be run on that particular data type, and then it can be used in multiple spots. So just as in our other application, we're going to define two instances of this X class. And set var1 equal to A and B. Now again, what's going to happen is, as this class is a template, when you create this new instance of the class X and assign it to variable 1, this is basically saying that variable x1 is going to have this template assigned up here. So it's going to have a var1 variable. So when we assign var1 to it, it sort of gets its own copy of that var1 variable. So each instance of a class, and this is sort of an important concept, it is an important concept, which is why I'm kind of harping on it a little bit, is that every time you create a new instance of a class, you're sort of basically creating a whole copy of this class here in a new way for that particular variable. So we're creating a whole copy of the var1 property, and we can set it the value A. Now when we create this x2 variable that's another instance of that class X, we're creating another whole copy of that class, which includes its own version of var1. Oops, I made a mistake down here. So when we set x2 var1 equal to B, x2's var1 property is completely separate from x1's var1 property. It's its own instance. In the same way that when we call, for example, if we were to call this get var1 method on our x1 object, it is basically calling its sort of own version of that particular method. And the way it does that is using this keyword. So as mentioned before, essentially what happens when you call this get var1 method is this function up here gets replaced with, I'll just use a shortened syntax. without the public keyword. So again, it's as if when x1 calls this object method, it calls that method on itself, on its own instance. So what it does is when this method gets run, this gets replaced essentially with x1. So it's just as if we were accessing that var1 property of x1 directly. Now when x2 calls this getVar function, this is going to get replaced essentially with x2. And so basically what this is just sort of reinforcing is this concept that the class provides a template of the properties and functions and methods that a particular class can have. And by when you instantiate or create a new instance of each class, you get copies of essentially get copies of each of the different properties, a new var1 property for each instance, and you also get sort of your own version of the getVar function. And the way that you do that is using this method, which PHP is able to sort of dynamically interpret when you call that function. So now we can define this getVar1 function one time, and it's going to work on any time we have a object of the class X. So one common operation performed on objects, a common method that's performed, is to get and set their property values. We just saw an example in our person object of something that's known as a getter. It returned the value of our first name property. It was called getFirstName. So getter methods retrieve the value of an object's property, and its setter methods set the value of an object's property. Now we've actually been able to do this. Let's say we had our person1 from before. We can set its first name using this syntax here. So we actually don't need these getter and setter methods. But it's a common thing that's done, and it's actually a special topic within object-oriented programming and within PHP that we're going to get to in another lesson. So I just wanted to at least mention it, or at least introduce the concept of it. So now we can set the first name property of this person1 using this this syntax that we use, the object accessor syntax. But instead we could create a method, a setter method, and say person1, let's say we set first name equal to Joe. We could define a method called setFirstName that passes it the value Joe. And what that's going to do is, if this is a setter, it's going to take this value Joe, and then within the class definition, it's going to set the value of that property, of the first name property, by using the this variable. We're going to see that in a second. And one of the main reasons I'm also demonstrating this is it shows how you can use the this variable to not only return values from an object and to access values, property values of an object, but also to be able to set them. So for example, if we look at a new version of person, our person class, we have the same two properties, the first name and last name, and then we've defined what are known as getter functions for each of the properties. We define getFirstName and getLastName, and what they do is they use the this special variable to return the last name and first name respectively of these of this particular instance of a person object. Then we also have setter functions, which take a parameter. So again, object methods can take parameters just as any other function does. And then here we're using the this variable, and we're using the accessor syntax to set the value of a particular property. So in this case, we're saying when this function is called on an object, we're saying on that instance of that object, we're going to have the first name property, and we're going to set it equal to this first name variable, which is passed in here. So this is how you can use the this function in order to also set function properties, object properties. So if we go and look at a test script, getters and setters, we can see that we create a new person object, and now instead of using the method that we had done before to set the first name and last name of the person, which uses this accessor syntax, we're going to use our setter methods. So we're saying person1 set first name Joe, set last name Smith. The same thing down here, and it's going to perform the exact same function as when we had set them manually. And when we go to output the person's first and last name, we're going to use the getters get first name and get last name on each object. What they're going to do is they're going to show that those values we set with these setter methods actually set those methods for those particular objects. So when we load this script up, we can see that it says person number one's first name was Joe, person number one last name was Smith, and the same for Jane Jones, who is person number two. And so what you can see is that we've been able to set object properties, use it within an object method, and that uses the this function. And then we're also able to access those properties using the this variable, and we do that using our getter methods down here. So one thing I want to talk about now is how to output. Well, object methods are functions, and they return values. And we've used before. We've had strings where maybe we have the value of a function that we want to output, and you can't include that within double quoted strings. You can't call a function within double quoted strings. However, you can include the output of object methods within double quoted strings. And the way you do that is using the curly brace syntax. So let's say we define a person object, variable person1. We're going to define it as a new instance of the person class. We're going to use that setter we defined. We're going to set its first name to Joe, and then we want to output the first name. Well, what we can do is if we want to output the value that get first name method on person1 object returns, is we simply call the method using our normal method calling syntax and just enclose it within curly braces within our double quotes. And this is opposed to having to use the concatenation operator and abbreviate. And so basically, it's basically a nice little trick that makes our code easier to work with. So now we can include method names, these methods within a string. And that's something that, let's say this wasn't an object. Normally for a function we couldn't do that anyway, so if we had a function called getFirstName, not an object, a method, just a function, we wouldn't be able to include that normally within double quoted strings anyways. So let's just take a look at this in action. We have our same person object that we had in our last example, has the getters and setters for the first and last name. We go ahead and we instantiate two person objects, set them with the same names we did before, Joe Smith and Jane Jones. And now what we're going to do is, whereas before we output their names using this concatenation operator, we said person first name, the dot operator, and then we called the method getFirstName. Now we know we can do it all within one string. And so instead of, actually, if we look back again, instead of having basically sort of three separate strings here that we're concatenating together, we can include it all in one, and you do that using this curly brace syntax. So we actually, this does the same thing as the last script does, except we're making use of including the outputs of an object method within a double quoted string. And if we look at what it looks like when we browse to it, it's going to look exactly the same. And you can see that here. So one final topic that I want to talk about is using the this variable. You can also use that to call other methods from within object methods. So for example, when we were in our, take a look at our person class, when we were in getLastName, we could use this to refer to the particular instance of the object. When this method runs, this gets basically set to whatever instance of that object you're running the method on, and it returns and we use this to access that last name property of that person object. We can also use this to call object methods from within itself. So for example, we have our function hello down here, which before, if we look at a very first version of it, it just returned a string. Well, now what we're doing is we're calling our function hello, and within our function hello, we're actually going to say Joe says hi or Jane says hi. And the way we're going to do that is by making use of this getter function we defined for this person class, and we're going to call it within this object method. And the way we do that is using this variable again. So when we create a variable, a person variable, we set its first and last name, and then we call the hello method, for example, on person 1. What's going to happen is hello is going to get called. This is sort of going to get replaced with the person 1 object, and then it's going to say call the get first name method on it. Well, get first name is defined within the class. It'll go up here and it'll say return this dot first name. So then this will also know that it refers to person object 1, because PHP sort of does that for you automatically. It's going to get the first name property of it and return it. So then it's going to put that name here and then concatenate it to this so-and-so says hello. So this is an example of how you can use this variable to also call object methods from within other object methods. So basically you can access object properties using this variable, and you can also call other object methods within them as well. So if we run this script, we can see that now we get an output message that says Joe says hello or Jane says hello. So when this ran, when this function is called, we're calling on this object, we're calling the get first name method. So on person 1, we're calling get first name. And when we go to get first name, we're returning the first name property of the person 1 object that's replaced by this, and then that's how that gets output. Now this isn't a particularly sort of real-world example. So something that's a little more real-world is maybe, because we're typically not going to be using getter and setter functions, as you'll see in a future lesson, something that we might do is maybe we'll define a function called get full name. Because full name is not a property of a person object, you can't access it using the accessor syntax. So for example, assuming this, let's just say this was in a random script, you couldn't say full name because full name is not a property of person 1. What we can do, though, is create a useful method that's going to return the full name, and what that's going to do is basically concatenate the first name and the last name, which are properties of that object, and return that. And that might be a useful function. We're going to say, give me the first name of, or give me the full name of this person. So if we define a object method in our person class called getFullName, we basically return a string, and this is using our curly brace syntax again to basically output, well, in this case it's outputting object properties within a string. We're saying when you call getFullName, you're going to return a string that's the concatenation, or that's going to contain the value of the first name property of this particular object, followed by a space, followed by the value of the last name property of this object. And so now, in our function hello, we can make use of this function. You can make use of it externally, but we're going to make use of it internally here to again sort of reinforce the idea that you can call object methods within other object methods. So we're going to update our hello function to now say it's going to call this.getFullName. So when hello gets called, it's going to say on this object call the getFullName object method, and then it's going to return a string that has the first name and last name basically concatenated together of this particular object, and then we're going to concatenate that says hello, and so the output message is, or hello is basically going to return a string that's going to say Joe Smith says hello or Jane Jones says hello. So if we look at the output of this script, we can see Joe Smith says hello, Jane Jones says hello. So that sort of just is a combination of all the different things that we've learned, and something that's maybe more practical, a more practical use of how you would see these things, these object methods used. So for today's homework challenge, it's kind of an advanced homework challenge. I'm going to have you create a class called HTTP request. That's basically going to represent an HTTP GET request message, and that's something we learned about in an earlier lesson in the course. And I want this HTTP request class to have two properties, one called URI, which is a string, and that's going to represent the URI that this particular request object would be requesting, and then a headers property, which is an associative array that's going to contain name-value pairs of any HTTP headers for a particular HTTP request that this HTTP request object would be representing. And then I want you to add, so now we have our properties of it. I want you to add a method to the class called addHeader that takes two properties. In this case, they're called name and value, or it takes two parameters, where the name represents the name of a particular HTTP header, and the value represents the value of the header. So, for example, the name might be host, which is an HTTP header, and the value might be educator.com. So what this addHeader method is going to need to do is it's going to be able to need to access this headers property of the HTTP request object in order to add this name value pair to it. And so in order to do that, to access from within an object method the properties of that object, you need to use the this variable. So you're going to have to use the this variable within this method here. Then I want you to add a method called getHeaders. And basically what it's going to do is going to return a string in proper HTTP request format that represents all of the headers that are in this headers array up here. So again, you're going to have to use the this variable to access this headers array. And basically what you're going to do is loop over the array and then output each header on its own line with the name and value separated by a semicolon. And so that's going to be a method that's going to be used internally within the function. Finally, I want you to define a method called getRequest. And this is the method that's basically going to be used by people that are using this class. They're going to instantiate an HTTP request object. They're going to set its URI. They're going to maybe add some headers using the addHeaders function. And then they're going to say, call the getRequest method, which is going to say, give me the formatted HTTP request that is represented by the URI and headers of this particular object. So what getRequest is going to do is it's going to create the required first line of an HTTP request, which has the method name. In this case, it's going to be get, the URI, and the HTTP version. And then it's going to call the getHeaders method to append all of the HTTP headers to this first line that it creates. So this is an example of an object method calling another object method. In this case, getRequest is going to be calling the object method getHeaders. Then just in a separate script, I want you to instantiate an HTTP request object, set the URI property to index.html, and you can just use the object accessor syntax, and then add, using the addHeader method, two HTTP headers, one called host and one called user agent, which are both real HTTP headers. You can set them to whatever value you want. It's not as important for the example, but just the fact that you're going to be practicing using object methods. And then call the getRequest method on that object, and output what it returns in between pre-tags, which is going to basically show like the output formatted in sort of this form down here, which is a sort of like a computer text format. And then verify that your output has the form shown here. So for example, this first line of yours should be exactly the same as this. It should say get /index.html http /1.1, and then it should have two header lines, one for host and one for user agent, and the value should be set to whatever values you supply to that addHeaders method. Notice that they're formatted properly with a colon and a space in between here, and you're going to be doing that in your getHeaders method. And so basically for this, you need to make sure that you're appropriately using the this variable to call, for example, the getHeaders method from within the getRequest method, and also to be able to access that headers variable and the URI variable. So for example, when we're outputting this first line in our getRequest method, we're going to have access to the URI property of this class. So as a little hint, one of the things that you're going to need to do is use the this URI in order to access that. So just make sure you properly use the this variable, and that you also practice when calling the methods, you practice using that same accessor syntax that we use to call methods. For example, say we had an object of HTTP request called HTTP to call the getRequest method on it. As you'll remember, we use this dash greater than sign, the name of the method, in this case, followed by parentheses. In this case, getRequest doesn't take any parameters, so it'll just be empty parentheses. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com. I look forward to seeing you next time.